All right, folks, in the last video, I talked about the dumbing down of America, and today I want to talk about the dumbing up of American children. Now, that's a weird phrase you say, so what do you mean by that? By that, I mean the false sense of assurance that parents fall into when they send their kids to these so-called great school districts. That is, these parents aren't sending their kids to school districts in working class or disadvantaged areas. No, they're instead going upwards to more upscale areas and hence to a so-called better school district. I understand that. But I call that dumbing up because that upward progression, I will hopefully later show, is in actuality not the smartest option available. And let me begin my explanation by taking you back to 1998. Back then I was in grad school at the time and I was getting a little burnt out, so I decided to get my head out of the books for a little while and change the pace. I had to change my environment a little. So soon after I found myself at a nearby ghetto area, a very rundown section of town where I was applying to be a substitute teacher. Now, I figured these students were hurting, and they could certainly use all the help they could get. So I went in with these idealizations of being useful to a student population that had, for all intents and purposes, they'd been ignored and neglected by the system. Well, as you might guess, I was quickly hired. And truth be told, they were just desperate for anyone who was crazy enough to substitute teach in this rundown area. And soon afterwards, I was working at many, many school locations at all different grade levels. On some days, I'd work with elementary kids, beautiful, innocent kids, nicely behaved at that age, I might add. And then on other days, I'd be in a middle school, and boy, those kids were out of control. Let me tell you, complete bedlam, fights everywhere, graffiti everywhere, you name it, just horrendous conditions. And then still on other days, I'd be in the high schools, and that's where the gangster kids were, and they were scary. Let me tell you, they'd get right in your face, and they would not follow directions, and they'd really be on edge almost the entire school day. So my experiences really ran the whole gamut in this school district, and for the most part, I was really enjoying myself. I really mean that, because I was really getting into the challenge of facing what was out there, of not hiding from this reality, of trying to challenge myself to be an agent of change, no matter how difficult it seemed. I wanted to do good for my fellow man, no matter where these kids happened to find themselves, no matter what their station in life was. And I really dug it. I really loved the challenge. Well, one day, while working at a school site in the more poor part of town, a teacher approached me while I was eating alone in the classroom during lunchtime, and she came up to me and said, hey, I need someone to sub for my class. Are you available? And I said, sure. When would that day be? And then she said, well, it's not for a day, but for the rest of the school year. At first I was dumbfounded, and then she continued to explain. She said, I know that sounds funny, but I just got accepted to a graduate program in New York, and I got to fly out on a plane next week. Now, what she was doing was actually very common. It wasn't the first time I heard that. This was such a rough school district to work in that many new teachers would simply bail. A lot of them would wait till the end of the year, but a lot of them didn't. They couldn't hack it, and they didn't wait, and they'd bail right in the middle of the school year like this woman was doing. In such cases, the principal would almost invariably be upset, and the principal would say something like this: you could go, but you better damn well find me someone to replace you, because don't you dare leave me hanging. I want you to find a warm body to put in that classroom, because you ain't going to go until you do. And that's what this woman was doing. She had that level of desperation in her voice. And so, to make a long story short, I accepted this long-term substitute position, and with that, I also accepted all the long-term teaching and record-keeping responsibilities as well. I actually took over the class on January 4th and then stayed till the end of the year in June. Now, this was a second grade class, and they actually assigned an IA, or an instructional aide. She was reassigned from another class to me. She was a much, much older woman. She was Mrs. D, very grandmotherly and very helpful. She was very motherly to the kids, and that helped smooth the transition. And so I started teaching these kids, and the first thing that struck me was I couldn't believe how basic the material was. I mean, it was almost at a kindergarten level. I was actually kind of shocked. I even got bored after a while, I have to admit, and I could see the kids were getting bored as well. The previous teacher, who is now long gone, obviously was just following the curriculum, and it was obviously pitiful, not that she even cared, which she apparently didn't. But since I was a substitute teacher, the entire staff, all the other teachers, they just basically left me alone without offering any help. They didn't care. So I came up with an idea by myself, and that's when I asked the kids, are you guys happy doing this very basic work? And they just stared at me. And then I said again, come on, this is really boring me, and I think in my heart that you can do way more than this. In fact, I know you can. And a few of the students said, yeah, we can. And then a few more joined in, and finally they all broke out and cheered, yes, 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 let's do more. I couldn't believe it. I knew they meant business, and I sensed it deep inside, because I think they could intuitively feel that I was in it with them, and that I was going to actually try my best to get them to learn. It wasn't long before we went from a single edition, which they were doing for the longest time, and we went to double edition. And then a few weeks after that, we were doing triple edition. And then a few weeks after that, we were doing quadruple digit addition. And we were progressing faster than I keep up, let me tell you. And then I went on to other subjects, and I had them memorize all 50 states, and they ate that up like that. And then we tackled the capitals of each state. They also ate that up like that. And then in math, we were advancing so much that we even began to learn our multiplication tables. And then sometime after that, we started to do double-digit multiplication and then triple-digit multiplication. They were just taking off. Every morning, we began reading English as a class for an hour a day. We read books after book after book. Everyone took a turn reading a paragraph, and their reading levels just took off as well. And for 1 hour every day, I take them all outside to the PE field, and we do calisthenics, military-style 4-count calisthenics. They loved it. And after the calisthenics, we'd run 8 laps around the entire field until everyone was exhausted, including myself. I remember some of the other teachers saying, that's not really necessary. But then I replied to them and I said, I think physical activity is tied to a student's mental strength. And so we kept it up. And this was, mind you, way before childhood obesity issues were widely held as they are now. I would even bring a juicer to class every now and then, and we'd juice carrots and apples, and Mrs. D would help me with all of that stuff. And the students loved it. I mean, they were waking up mentally, physically, and spiritually. And they were motivated beyond the norm because I was setting the bar beyond the norm, and they were eating it up. Let me tell you that, folks. When their 5th and 6th grade brothers and sisters would come pick them up after school so they could both walk home together, I'd place the 6th grader next to my 2nd grader, and I'd quiz them both on math, geography, grammar, or what have you. And my students would almost always beat out their much older brothers and sisters. And that instills such a pride in my little students that what they were doing was really working, and it was showing results. As our time went on, as all good things, our time was coming to a close, so I decided to do something special. I coordinated with Mrs. D an end-of-the-year school field trip to UC Berkeley. And that was a big hassle because they didn't have money for that, but I fought and fought for it. I finally got it. I had many contacts at UC Berkeley, and so I set up meetings where my students would meet with world-class professors. We met with a few of them, and then we met with a community outreach specialist, and then we even met later on and had pizza with some undergraduate and graduate students who spoke to them, who were not only attending UC Berkeley themselves, but they had also grew up in underserved areas as well. But the big finale of the field trip was when my class actually sat in on a real university lecture. I wanted to make sure that they got exposed to that. And so when we entered the classroom, my little 2nd graders, their eyes grew wide. I mean, they couldn't believe they were in such an important place. They had never seen anything like it. And as we took our seats, all the other undergraduates in this great big 300-seat lecture hall, they were smiling at us. And as the lecture came to a close, the professor later on asked us to stand. And our little 2nd grade class, we all stood to our feet. And this world-class professor said, he spoke to everyone and said, everyone, I want to introduce you to these very special visitors who have come here all the way from Oakland, and they represent the future, and one day they too will be in your seats. So I want us all to give them a great big hand and thank them for being here. And the entire undergraduate class stood to their feet, and they gave us a standing ovation. And as I looked over to my students, I could see tears welling up in their eyes. And for this one tiny moment in their lives, they felt so important. I could sense it. And it had a huge impact on them. I know it did. It had a huge impact on me. Soon after that, I left the class since my assignment there was over. But I did later see the instructional aide, Mrs. D, down at the district headquarters one afternoon. And she hugged me and she said that the students still ask for me and all that. However, she noted with sadness that although the students were now in 3rd grade, that their new teachers were boring them. She actually was an instructional aide in one of those 3rd grade classrooms. And she said to me, "Oh, teacher, I can't tell you how much it breaks my heart to see them in their new classes. They look so sad. The work they do now is so simple that they don't feel challenged anymore. And I talk with some of them," she went on to tell me, "and they miss you very badly. They miss the exciting ways you challenge them. And they look so sad." We were talking for a while about that. Apparently, the 3rd grade teacher that they now had reverted and returned to the dumbed-down curriculum, and with tragic results because he lost all those kids. After a few minutes, we said our goodbyes, and I never did see Mrs. D or my former 2nd graders ever again after that. Now, let me segue here and talk about the dumbing up of America, because this story has a relationship to what I'm about to talk about. When you move your child into a quote-unquote good school district, what you're essentially comparing your school scores with are those in other school districts, right? On a national level and on a state level, that is. And if there exist district scores out there that are lower than your district's, It's usually because those other districts have less resources or they're in poor areas. And so comparatively speaking, these other poor districts are going to, by default, raise your good district scores when you measure them side by side. And I say this for one thing, because it's very easy for these good school districts to overinflate the validity of the claims of their scores. Why do I say that? Because, like I said, you're essentially going up against and being compared to only those schools within our nation, within our state. And since Common Core has set the bar so low, the better off school districts with more resources have a much easier time picking up all the trophies and saying, hey, look, we're rated this high over here, or we're rated high over there. And then I say, well, of course you did. Look who you're comparing yourself to. Now, the much better question to ask these school districts is this: how does your school rank internationally? Now that's an interesting question. Now you got a whole new set of algorithms, a whole new set of international student performers who only play hardball. Well, as you can guess, the rankings in the so-called good American school districts would plummet when compared internationally. Now, remember that study I quoted in my last video blog, the one by the National Education Commission on Time and Learning? Well, if you don't recall, let me say it again. It was a 2-year-long study on how students spend their day in school, how the average student spends their day in school. And the results were astounding. They found that a typical American student only spent 41% of their day on basic academic subjects like science, history, English, and math, and etc. The other 59% of their time during the day is spent doing coursework on consumer training, gym classes, driver's ed, self-esteem, family life, sexual orientation education, holistic health, AIDS education, environmental education, and so on, and a lot of other topics. Now, according to the study, that all added up to only 1,490 hours on basic academic subjects like science, history, English, and math throughout their entire high school years, which is their freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior years. Now, compared to other developed countries that were included in the study, the Japanese students spent 3,170 hours on academic subjects throughout their entire school years. The French students spent 3,280 hours on academic subjects throughout their entire school years. And the German students spent a whopping 3,528 hours on academic subjects throughout their high school years. Now, what's all this really saying? Well, it's saying that students from Japan, France, and Germany, and other developed countries spend twice as much on hardcore academic subjects than American kids do. Now, if you examine the study itself, it spells out this conclusion in no uncertain terms. It says, and I quote, "No matter how the assumptions underlying the figures are modified, the result is always the same. Students abroad are required to do work on demanding subject matters at least twice as long. In practical terms, this means that most foreign students are studying language, literature, science, and 2 or more languages, while many of our young people in the United States spend their time in study halls, pep rallies, driver education, and assemblies," end quote. Okay, but maybe I can put it another way that makes better sense. If you wanted to equal the academic performance of our foreign counterparts in this study, you'd have to take your son or daughter, have them go through high school just like they normally would, through their freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior years. Then, right when they're about to graduate, you'd have to tell them to forego the graduation ceremony, turn them right around, and enroll them back into high school, and have them go through another additional 4 years of high school all over again, through their freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior years all over again. Now, that would be the only way under the current American educational system that an American kid could equate the number of hours that their foreign counterparts spend on rigorous and demanding subject matters. Just think about that. But what is happening here instead is that American kids only go through 4 years of high school, as they normally would. And then we brag about ourselves because we graduated from a quote-unquote great school. Yeah, when compared to other poor or working-class school districts around you. But you do absolutely crappy when compared to the real and actual statistics of your international counterparts. But the irony doesn't stop there. If you examine the amount of money that the United States spends on each student, the numbers are off the chart. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, puts out a yearly report on how much developed countries contribute to education. And guess what? Yep, you guessed it, but I'll let you hear it directly from them because the report reads, quote, "The United States spends more than other developed nations on its students' education each year, with parents and private foundations picking up more of the cost," an OECD survey found, end quote. But you may ask, exactly how much do we spend yearly? Well, the report states that we spend more than $11,000 per elementary student and more than $12,000 per high school student. So, to summarize, Under our current educational system, if we ever wish to equal the time spent on demanding subject matters to match that of our foreign counterparts, you'd have to take your son or daughter and have them go through high school twice. And that, my friends, would bring the grand total of spending to not $12,731 per high school student, but we would need to double that to the amount of $25,462 per high school student. Think about that. And where does all this money go? Have you ever thought about that? It goes into the federal, state, and local education bureaucracy. And think about this. With homeschoolers all across the nation outperforming both American public school students and international students alike, in record numbers, mind you, and doing it at a fraction of the cost. At a fraction of the cost, people. Why wouldn't our government be encouraging more of its citizens to homeschool? Yeah, why not? I'll tell you why. Because that would be cutting into the federal and state coffers. That's why. And it also ensures the system that you'll keep crawling and begging to these so-called good school districts, pleading and begging them to do their magic. But they're not doing magic, folks. They're doing a piss-poor job, and they know it, especially when you compare their so-called high scores to their international counterparts. But maybe that's not what people want to hear. Maybe. Maybe we just really want to live in the fantasy of our own image. Or maybe we just want to keep on going thinking that we're the world's best at everything, even though the statistics don't bear that out. If that's the case, I'll just turn off the lights here and let you go back to your slumber. And so again, I say, thanks for listening and have a very, very good night. Sweet dreams.